I can't help the feeling of looking back at House of the Dragon in its first season and thinking, that was actually pretty lucky. This probably should not have worked out as well as it did. And look, before I lose your attention, let me cut to the chase here. Because House of the Dragon is setting itself up to be massively successful, and I think the second season will prove to be even more popular than the first season. And I think I figured out why. Even if you've never read the books, I think it's actually pretty easy to explain why this show has worked so well for you. For one, you're back in a familiar place, and even if you hated the ending of Game of Thrones, you're kind of getting a fresh start. And you're seeing a Westeros at a time that was only slightly mentioned before in Game of Thrones, but now you actually get to see what it was like for the people to actually live among the Targaryens and their dragons, plus you get to see the Targaryens at the height of their power. So if only for curiosity alone, it might be worth checking out. But I don't think House of the Dragon fans are so simple that maybe just some CGI effects will hold your attention for very long without any substance. And that's where I think the showrunners made a really good choice by fleshing out a character that really had some of the most limited source material in the books. Viserys, as portrayed in House of the Dragon, I think is the greatest accomplishment in the entire show. While book fans know that Viserys in so many ways is central to the overall conflict between the Greens versus the Blacks in the Dance of the Dragon Civil War, he's never truly a point of emphasis in the books that House of the Dragon is based on. The book material really just seems to skim over Viserys as a character, but starting out in episode 1, Viserys almost becomes the star of the show, and we see this almost goofy, playful, and seemingly carefree character become emotionally destroyed within the pilot episode. As the first episode moves along, the importance of Viserys having a male heir seems pretty important. But unlike the White Walkers showing up first thing in Game of Thrones, introducing a threat of some sort, and then hearing from Ned Stark reciting his house words that winter is coming, the audience can start to really connect with the stakes in Game of Thrones. We don't know how significant the threat is, but we do know there's a threat. That pilot episode of Game of Thrones also introduces the threat of Daenerys and her brother Viserys potentially coming over to Westeros and causing problems for the realm. Game of Thrones' first episode also ends with Jaime pushing Bran from the tower. The conflicts are almost obvious in a way, and discovering how these issues will be resolved alone can compel audiences to return for episode 2. There's some good character moments also in Game of Thrones, but the events is really what pushed us forward into episode 2 after the pilot. House of the Dragon doesn't have any of that to really rely on. Instead, whatever may be the central conflict is a bit more vague. Audiences come into this show with the promise of a war among dragons, and yet that is hardly the focus of the pilot at all. Instead, House of the Dragon leans heavily into character tension, and like the books, Viserys is central to this, but in the books he's not emphasized at all. The show changes that. Viserys is almost foolishly optimistic at first glance. Kind of like Robert in Game of Thrones, his priorities seem to focus much more on the tournaments and keeping everyone happy and avoiding inner conflicts. But similar to Robert, there's something that troubles him beneath the surface. And like Robert, he seems to worry over this invisible threat. While Viserys isn't masking this with drinking and partying and indulging in women outside of his marriage, Viserys keeps this mask of almost denial that any conflict among the kingdom could arise. At least that was my first thought, is that this character will do anything to avoid conflict, as you can see the way he handles the small council's concerns with his brother Daemon. Kind of like Robert not allowing Ned to do anything when he's attacked by Jaime, Viserys tries to deflect the significance of the tension between the other characters. Viserys remains almost neutral to anything, but then something happens that profoundly changes the way Viserys is viewed. The death of Aemma Arryn. It totally recharacterizes Viserys. He's not just grieving the loss of his wife and his newborn son, he feels that he sacrificed his wife. And as the season progresses, it becomes clear that Aemma truly meant so much more to him, and that loss has impacted him greatly. He shows that he's hurt by his guilt and loss of the death of Aemma, even mistakenly calling his new wife Alicent by Emma's name. He's constantly at odds with his brother, whom he defends at every turn, even when Daemon disrespects him or challenges him by creating tension with Otto Hightower. Viserys forgives him over and over for everything. Viserys is the most nuanced character in the first season, and compared to the books where he's almost an afterthought, House of the Dragon has brought him to the forefront and uses this character to keep the show glued together. But it all comes back to the pilot episode, episode 1, and Emma and Aaron's death. It was one of the most brutal scenes from the show. Of course, visually it was difficult to look at, but emotionally, the show did a great job at connecting the audience with the impact that it had on Viserys. And when I watch this, I don't blame Viserys for choosing to try and save the baby, but when it is presented as an impossible choice, it reframes things a little bit. And this gives way to a darkness over Viserys moving forward, as he's hit with that guilt over and over again, and you could argue maybe he doesn't deserve it. But even without the choice to save the baby over Emma, he also feels another guilt for deciding that a male heir was of utmost importance. By the end of the episode, he decides to choose Rhaenyra as his successor, in a way trying to relieve his guilt perhaps by finally doing the right thing in what he feels maybe he should have done from the very beginning. Look, you don't need me to tell you the story, but when this episode ends, are we as an audience entirely clear on the conflict that awaits us in episode 2? Really go back and think about episode 1. It kind of ends without any pending doom or threat or anything at the end of the episode. What questions did you have to have answered going into episode 2? See, I don't think that's what brought people back in greater numbers for episode 2. And that part is true. More people tuned in for episode 2 than the premiere episode. So what did that, if not some type of cliffhanger? See, I think House of the Dragon brought them back with emotionally compelling them with character development. And again, I look at Viserys as a great example, but there's so many questions about what is going on with many of them. Daemon leaves King's Landing after an emotional interaction with Viserys in the throne room. Rhaenyra is given this grand responsibility as heir and of fulfilling prophecy, but it's some of those more subtle details that we get out of those interactions with Otto Hightower and Alicent. I go back to the tourney and make note of Alicent picking at her fingers and displaying some anxiety. I ask where this is leading, and I don't know, but I want to discover more about this character. And Otto's sending her in what we can all assume is a mission to seduce King Viserys. It makes you wonder about the dynamic between Alicent and Otto. The presentation of Daemon as a total wildcard leaves audiences guessing about whether he will become a threat, and if so, to who. We're not necessarily looking for the story to move forward, we're looking for the characters to move forward. You see, House of the Dragon didn't rely on spectacle or events to bring audiences back. There's actually a lot of heart and emotion put into the characters in that pilot episode, which invests the audience in seeing where these characters could go. And that's a risk difficult to take in a show that you think is about dragons, but it grounded the story from the start. Where having dragons on screen the majority of the time would have been the really easy thing to do, House of the Dragon invested much of their budget into making every scene seem stunning, only to highlight the characters though. Game of Thrones in many ways framed the lens in which House of the Dragon would be judged. If House of the Dragon was released on its own without any prior Game of Thrones and it wasn't a prequel and it was just a standalone show, it may not have received the immediate popularity, but there's a good chance it would have been even more well received critically. Because Game of Thrones' later seasons had so many contrived moments and narrative conveniences full of plot armor, etc., the moment anything similar happens in House of the Dragon, those who are looking for something to be critical about could easily point to those moments and say, you see, this is exactly what ruined Game of Thrones. But if you look back at House of the Dragon's first season and you seek out all of those scenes critics would compare to the worst of Game of Thrones, there's really not a whole lot to go off of. There's maybe like 3 or 4 scenes that you could really point to. But even in spite of being judged more harshly in a post-Game of Thrones world, House of the Dragon has been a success for 2 key reasons. First, it obviously does fill the gaps of the lore and fleshes out events book fans have read about in Fire and Blood, but didn't have a ton of context to or nuance. But also what I think it hits on the most is that it leaned heavily into character development compared to the source material, which gives so much more weight and context to the events that will eventually unfold because we're so invested into the characters. I want to see the Dragonfire on Dragonfire fights. I think that's going to be really interesting visually. But personally, what I think is really making me want to come back is being emotionally compelled by these characters and to see where they're going. And I think the best is yet to come.